What's up, guys, and welcome back to another Diablo 3 how-to guide. And today we're going to be covering gear optimization and damage, right? Well, just optimizing gear and your damage. Now, this is a question I kind of get a lot about just, what stats to roll, why we roll certain stats on gear, and kind of just how to increase your overall DPS for pushing GRs and whatnot whenever you hit like a plateau, I guess you could say. So we're going to start off pretty simple. We're going to go through the Mystic. We're going to talk about the different gear slots, which gear slots actually are, dedicated for, certain types of stats. And then we'll go over like kind of my opinion on how to even out damage and just improve damage overall. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Also hit that little bell next to the subscribe button to get notified for any new videos. And let's get started. What we're going to do is I'm just going to remove all my gear. We're going to go through this one slot at a time, and I'll show you how the Mystic works and kind of my process on optimizing gear as I'm kind of going through either a season or just leveling a new character from scratch or whatever. So I kind of break down each one of these slots into different jobs. Each slot, each gear piece is required to provide me a certain ability. There's a lot of crossovers here too. So we're gonna be talking about offensive, defensive, and then just kind of how each gear piece operates. So we're gonna start off with defensive gear slots first, and generally these are your belt, with the exception of maybe a witching hour, which has crit damage. But generally on your belt, you're gonna be rolling things. I mean, we're also gonna everything's gonna have your primary stat on it, so we're not gonna take those into account. We're talking about the other abilities that are possible on each one of these pieces. So if you look at belts, right, we'll put this belt in here. Obviously I already have 15% to life on here, but if you go here, this little question mark, it'll show you all the possibilities for that slot there, which is kind of what's available on this piece of gear. Obviously, out of all this stuff, 15% to life is better, and you're also obviously going to be trying to balance everything as well, health points as far as recovery, resistances, everything like that. Long story short, belt is going to be a defensive piece, with the exception of certain things that have offensive stats on them. You're going to be rolling things like bit, life percentage, and armor. And then obviously you can also have other primary damage abilities as well. Another defensive slot would be the pants, right? And this is going to usually have bit, life, armor percent. Just like if you throw pants in here, you're going to see that it's going to have also some primary skill increases or damage increases, as well as armor as well. Another one that actually falls under the defensive for me is boots, which is generally going to have, you can also have a skill damage on here as well, but you can also have things like movement speed and armor, and usually you want to roll a skill on here that's going to be effective DPS. It's going to boost up your effective DPS. So that impale damage for 15% is not going to show on my sheet, but it's going to show when I'm actually running rifts and everything is getting added together. All right, moving on to more offensive type stats or offensive slots. It's pretty much going to be everything else, with maybe the exception of the shoulders here. Shoulders can be kind of a crossover, but you're going to have bit, all resist, and armor, but you can also have things like area damage. And essentially, if you want to think about it this way, cooldown reduction can also technically be an offensive stat, because if the ability that you're trying to keep up 100% of the time is doing damage, then the more it's up, the more damage you're doing. So there's an argument there to be had that it is actually also an offensive stat. And then obviously gloves are a really big offensive piece. You're gonna roll, for me, I'm rolling all resist on here just because I was low on other pieces of gear, but gloves are always gonna have crit, crit damage, crit chance, or attack speed, or even cooldown reduction, what have you. Chest piece, now this is usually a defensive slot here, but for instance, Talrash's chest piece can have attack speed on it, but you're usually going to roll vit, life percent on this as well. And then obviously offhands can be a hybrid between offensive and defensive. You're going to have a lot of crit, attack speed, you're going to have light skill damage percents and all that stuff. And obviously your weapon is your biggest offensive slot. And when we get into damage, I'll actually explain how everything is calculated and what you should be looking for as far as stats go. And amulets also going to be offensive as well. You're gonna have attack speed, crit, cooldown reduction on that as well, or like skill damage percentage on that and then on like rings it's also gonna be very offensive as well. Whereas you can have defensive stats here, but usually this is reserved for like your crit and your cooldowns and your area damages and all that stuff like that. And then obviously your bracers. Your bracers are a really important piece. Bracers almost on every build in 2.6, or you pretty much since I don't know, probably for the past few patches, like bracers have been really important to provide that elemental skill damage, and also crit as well. So obviously whenever you're rolling stuff like this, there's a strategy. Like if you get a helm that drops that has like dex, we're just gonna use my gear as an example, but let's say you drop the shadow helm that has like dex, vit, and then like impale, right? Which is what mine is. And this actually needs to have crit on it, but I'll explain why it doesn't have crit. And actually I don't think it should have crit. Let me look at I haven't looked at my details in a while. No, I'm actually fine. But I'll explain like how you pick certain things as well, as far as like additive bonuses and multiplicative bonuses as well. But obviously, like if you needed crit on this and it had dex, vit, impale, then you're obviously gonna roll it in the mystic and optimize all your gear that way as well. And then also, for the weapon, if it rolls a socket, you should almost always roll that socket off at the mystic for like some other useful stat, because you can just use a gift to actually put a socket back on that. And also using an emerald in your weapon is going to help bring up your crit damage, so you don't have to actually stack too much crit damage on your gear and try to like, that's kind of like just how to like prioritize or how to classify each one of these slots and like kind of what stats to look for in each one. But now we're going to go over kind of like how to actually optimize all of your stats across the board to kind of like get the highest available DPS out of it. We're going to start at the very beginning and like the basics, right? So like for your weapon and like all your abilities, you'll see have like weapon percent damage. Like this says like impale is 750 weapon percent damage. Well, what is weapon percent damage? Like where do they get that from? Well, at first people think that, well, it's that 3083.4, which is actually incorrect. Where the skill damage percent comes from is actually the range of damage. So you're looking at the 1619 to 2223, right? So the way it's calculated, and you want to find the base weapon damage for your item. Now obviously this is going to be affected by also your attack speed. So like since this Carly's Point has a 7% attack speed on it, that's why we have a 1.61 attacks per second on here, which dynamically affects that range of numbers. So to find your actual base damage, you're going to take that 1619 by 2223, and you're going to add those together, and then you're going to divide them by 2, and that's going to give you your base weapon damage. And that's what everything scales off of. That's what all your skills will scale off of, and everything. And what can actually affect that too is if you have like damage ranges on your rings or your amulet, it'll actually affect that range of number as well as if you have like a ruby in your weapon where it adds damage to the weapon, it'll also dynamically add to that range as well, which will also scale all of your abilities. From that base calculation, from that base weapon damage, that's where everything gets multiplied off of, right? So you're gonna have, it's gonna multiply your base weapon damage by your primary stat, right? And then, which is, I'm at 17,000 on dexterity, and it's also going to multiply it by your whenever you calculate a critical strike chance, what it actually is, the way the game calculates it, it's going to be critical strike chance, critical strike damage, and that's going to be your critical strike value. So what it's going to do is it's going to take your base weapon damage, it's going to multiply it by your dexterity, and also multiply it by your crit, and it's going to multiply it by damage towards elites. It's going to multiply, well, long story short, it's going to actually multiply it against all of your multiplicative abilities, and also factor in all your additive abilities as well. And kind of the difference between additive abilities and multiplicative abilities, things like all of your damage set bonuses, like the 1200% on 2p set bonus here, that is multiplicative. Zystones of Vengeance and Bane of the Stricken, that's multiplicative. Crit chance is multiplicative as well. As far as additive bonuses, you're going to be looking at this lightning skill damage by 20 is additive. So if like I have 20 here, I'm going to get, that's the only bonus I have, I'm going to get 20%, right? But then if I also have 20% of lightning skill damage here, it's actually not going to be 20%. It's actually going to be like 16% because of relative diminishing returns. So the idea here is when you're ever optimizing your damage, you need to spread out your multiplicative abilities, and also use as few additive properties as possible. That's why a lot of people actually won't throw lightning skill damage on the bracers and on the amulet. Instead, they'll just have one, because even though you're getting another 20%, well, 16% technically, which is still more damage, it's actually better to probably roll something else on there. Another thing that is to be said too is, like, since crit is actually calculated by crit chance times crit damage, then it's actually better to even out your crit damage and crit chance for a higher value. And there's there's a calculator for crit damage, and I'll put that link in the description so you can see what on kind of how to calculate this as well. And like if you go to Diablo 3 planner or anything like that, there's a D3 planner. It does all this in the back end for you. That's why a lot of people don't really worry about it. But if you're stuck there at a plateau and you're trying to figure out why your damage doesn't really like increase with, like, you're kind of at that point where you're just like min maxing, like, oh, I need 1% here, or I need 1% on this, shifting your multiplicative abilities or stats around can actually up your DPS, as crazy as it might sound. I mean, you can lower your crit damage. If your crit damage is really high, and you can actually lower your crit damage and put more into move more into crit chance and actually increase your sheet DPS as well. Also, another thing I want to talk about is actually the difference between sheet damage and effective DPS, right? So sheet damage is this: all the quantifiable abilities on all your gear, the crit chance, all of the dexterity, the weapon based damage, all that stuff is getting added and formalized into this number, right? Which is a good thing to go off of. But whenever you get into rifts and you start fighting monsters, your damage is actually going to be a lot different, because things like this lightning skill damage is not going to be calculated into that, or any abilities like this increase impale by 15%, that's not going to be reflected on your sheet either. Another thing to note is when you get really high and you start actually optimizing your gear to push really high GRs, most of your upgrades are not going to show up on your sheet, right? You're going to get these effective DPS stats leveled out on your gear, and when you get into the rift, you're going to notice the big difference, but it's not actually going to change up here too much. But if you're actually spreading everything across your gear, like you're supposed to be, you're going to be optimizing this number as much as you can as well. Like right now, I could probably do without this much dexterity, so I could probably actually take out a lot of these emeralds and actually drop my dexterity and put it into something like all resist, or some other ability that's probably I'm going to get more for, because just like everything else, the more dexterity or the more primary stat you stack, the less value it has over time. Same with like crit and crit chance, the more you stack, the less, because you'll see it. Like you go roll a crit on an item, you're like, oh, I'm rolling 6 on this ring, and then you look at your sheet over here and it didn't go up by 6, it went up by some lower number, and that's why, because it's relative diminishing returns on that, and that's kind of how it works for all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's kind of a long-winded version, but it can actually get really complicated if you start looking at all the formulas and stuff. I didn't really want to go into too much detail like that. I just wanted to give you an idea what to kind of look for when you're checking out your gear and trying to make improvements. Yeah, I mean, there's stuff all over the internet, in forums and stuff. I don't know if there's actually a complete list of everything that's considered multiplicative and additive and all that stuff. But if I find anything, I'll add it to the description later on. If you find yourself plateauing, look at all your gear as a whole. If you have too much dexterity and you can bring it down a little bit to optimize it another way. There's about a million ways to look at it, and the best way to do it is actually D3 planner. You don't want to sit there and mess around with too much of your gear, because you waste a lot of mats and all that stuff. But a good thing to do is whenever you have get to a spot where you don't really know what to do or how to improve, import your character into something like D3 planner and just mess with stats and just see kind of how it changes things, but keeping that in mind, keep the additive properties to a minimum, and try to spread things off and spread out your multiplicative stuff as much as possible as well. And that's going to actually improve your DPS overall. I appreciate you guys for watching this. If you like this video and you want to see more like it, hit the like button. Also, if you want to see more Diablo 3 content, then hit the subscribe button. And to get notified of any new videos, hit that little bell next to the subscribe button. But yeah, again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.